Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Frederickson. Today we are going to talk about the origins of the Great Depression. Might I dare say the causes of the Great Depression. Now, our objective today is for you to be able to write a letter to President Roosevelt asking him to implement 8 changes that will pull us out of the Great Depression and really prevent a depression from ever happening again. Now, that's your objective. Now, from 1880 to 1914, we had the Progressive Era. We've studied that from 1914 to 1918. World War One. And then from 1919 to 1929, we had the Roaring Twenties. But now we dive into 29 to 41. Very interesting time period. Now, the United States is going to have a difficult time. And also, not just the US, but the world. We're going to bring them down with us. Now, why are we studying this period of time? Now, really what we're saying is the Great Depression had consequences. And by consequences, I mean there was great suffering. And we have an interest in trying to prevent that from happening again. Not only that, but the Great Depression led to such great suffering that one could argue that without the Great Depression, we would not have had the rise of Hitler and maybe World War II. So we certainly have an interest in figuring out how to prevent Great Depressions to avoid things like that. So we're going to study the causes so we can prevent them. I'm sorry, so that we can prevent them. I'm sorry, I got a little ahead of myself there and prevent these future disasters. So, first, what exactly is a Great Depression? Because we can't prevent one if we don't know what it is, and it's a long and severe recession. Now, that's a complicated definition because I don't necessarily know what a recession is. Let's figure it out together. Now, a recession is when the economy goes down, and that means less money, less jobs, it shrinks, but it has to shrink for 6 straight months in order to be classified as a recession. Now, what does that look like exactly? Well, when you have a terrible recession, the money supply, the amount of money you have goes down, and that's what happened in the 20s. The 30s, excuse me. The GDP, that's basically taking all the costs of all the goods that are produced in a country in a given point, like a year, all the cost of everything, that goes down too. So everything that you produce, if you look here, GDP went down in the 1930s. Trade, that goes down because you have less money to buy things and maybe even sell to produce. Now, the stock market also went down. Boom, 1930s. Total debt that you accumulate, boom. If you look, it massively went up in the Great Depression. And that's not, usually when you say things went up, that would be a positive thing. Not in this case. Unemployment, another example of that. In the 1920s, super low. 1930s, way up. So bank failures, not a good thing to fail, went way up. So this was a bad time. Not just that, it was a really bad time for all those reasons. Less money, less production, less trade, less investment in the stock market, more unemployment, more total debt, less banks went out of business, so less saving, so less loans. Whew, terrible, terrible time. And that's why we're starting the Great Depression and specifically how to prevent it in the future. So let's see how we got ourselves into this mess. Now, to understand that, we have to talk a little bit of economics first, which is everybody's favorite subject. Now, your money, there's 2 things you can do with it generally. You can spend it or you can save it. Now, it's better to spend it, at least in terms of the economy. For example, job creation. If you spend your money, it creates jobs. Let's say I get a ton of money and I bring it to Best Buy. Now, all of a sudden, Best Buy will get my money. They have to order more televisions because I just bought like 6 or something. Now, at that point, they need to hire more workers to sell those televisions. That's why spending leads to the creation of jobs. Now, let's take it further. Those people used to be just hanging on their couch. They didn't have jobs. So they had no money, but now they have money all because of me. And what do they do with that money? They spend it at all these other businesses, and those businesses then hire more workers. And that's what happens. You spend money, the economy gets better, businesses provide more jobs. Now, just a little spending leads to job creation. Now, can you imagine what a lot of spending does? It creates a cycle of just going up, 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 and up, if I could pronounce that. So the reverse is also true, unfortunately. So if you save a ton of money, meaning not spending it, then that's not a good thing because if you're not spending because you're saving, workers lose jobs because their companies don't get your money and then they have to lay people off. And if all of a sudden those companies are laying people off, those workers don't have money. And then they can't spend their money at these businesses, right? So then those businesses lay people off. And now you have even more people laid off with no spending ability. And with all that not spending, companies even lend off more people. Once again, it's just a cycle. You stop spending money, even more money doesn't get spent, and it goes down and down and down. So if we can figure this out, if we can maintain spending and get people to spend money, we just won't go down into those depressions or deep recessions. That's how we can prevent this. But that's a big if. It's super complicated, and we're going to do the best we can. So let's study the Great Depression in order to prevent it from ever happening again. So the key here is, why did the Great Depression happen? Because we stopped spending money. So the real question is, what stopped us from spending money? That's what caused the Great Depression. So let's look into it. Reason number one: Americans lost money in the stock market crash. So why did the stock market crash anyway? Well, the way that you make money is in the stock market is you buy stocks that are priced low and you sell them when they're high. So you bought the stock low, sell high. Again, what if you wait too long to sell that stock? Well, then you lose money. You don't want to do that. So once again, if you notice this, the stock market went down. You wanted to sell it at the peak if you look at my mouse. So the best time is to sell at the peak. You don't want to wait too long. So in 1929, the stock market had gone up for like 10 years, and it might have reached its peak. So economic reports that were out, and these are public, so everybody can read them. The message of the economic reports in 1929 was that consumers, that's you, the buyers, were buying less stuff, we're spending less stuff. And the second message was inventories, all the stuff in the warehouses that store all the stuff companies sell, were piling up. They were getting filled because people weren't buying them. So as inventories were piling up, companies were ordering less production of things. The third message of these economic reports, which again legally have to be public, is that factories were making less money, were reporting less income. So between the lower spending of people and inventories piling up and lower revenues for companies, investors were like, crap, I think I can tell, even though the stock market has been going up for 9 years, it is at its peak. Clearly, the people have less money now and businesses have less money. That means the stock market's about to go down. So that means I have to sell it as quickly as possible before it goes down to make the biggest profit. So everybody starts selling their money immediately in that September, October region of 1929. So in 1929, as everybody starts selling stock based off of these reports, stock prices go down. Now, why does that happen? Well, because stock is a perceived value. Basically, your stock is only worth what people are willing to pay. So if all of a sudden you have a stock of, let's say, if you have a stock of Apple that's worth $100 and nobody is willing to buy it, you'll say, oh, how about 90 bucks, 80 bucks, 60 bucks? Will somebody buy it for 50? When somebody buys it, it's now worth that lower price. And if everybody is selling their stock, that means nobody's willing to buy it and the prices just go down. That's how stock works. So the snowball effect occurs. People start selling and the prices go down. So it's at its peak, people sell, and now all of a sudden people have bought it for cheaper than it was before. People get worried. They're like, oh, it's going down, I should sell it quick. Well, they try to sell it. That causes the price to go down even more. They panic. I better sell this quick. But because everybody's selling, nobody wants to buy it because the price is going down. So they have to buy it for cheaper amounts, or that's what they're willing to do. And the price just goes down and crashes, and it happens exponentially quick. $40 billion gone in under a month. This is all money. So why does this contribute to the Great Depression? Well, for a lot of reasons. $40 billion lost out of an economy leads to less spending. That's money that people do not have. And if they no longer have that, they're not going to buy stuff. I know if I lost 40 billion, I probably wouldn't be going out buying a whole lot of things. So the stock market crash is going to take money from people and stop spending. And the stop spending leads to the Great Depression. Just one of the things. Now, what's another reason why people stop spending money? They didn't have any diversity within their investments. Now, all that surplus income you have, your savings, what should you do with it? Well, it's always smart to diversify. Basically, put it in different places. Put some in stocks, some in bonds, some in cash, some in property, some in mutual funds, some in gold. Put it in different places. That way, if one of these things screws up or has a problem, it hasn't taken down all of your money. Diversification is the key. You can also spend some if you want. But in the 1920s, the stock market was going up so much that Americans just said, hey, I could get rich if I just put it all in stocks. Now, why would they do this? Again, if you look at the market, it just went up, 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 and up for 10 years straight, even longer. So why not put it in there? You can't go wrong. So the problem was you're putting all your money in one basket, all of those eggs. And that's dangerous because in 1929, the market crashed. And it wasn't like you lost some of your money. You kind of started to lose all of it because your eggs were all in one basket. Now, again, they didn't lose a little, they lost big. So when you lose big, then no more spending for you. And if people don't spend, that hurts the economy. Now, we can draw some lessons from this. Number one, don't put all of your money in one basket, all of your eggs. Diversify, put it in different places. And of course, we have brokers to help you out with that and financial advisors or me. Now, next, that if you diversify, you can weather any storm because not every aspect of this goes down if the stock market goes down. So, boom. So why did people stop spending money? Because the stock market crashed and people weren't diversified, so it hurt more than normal. Also, margin calls are going to make it hurt more than normal. In the 1920s, the stock market was going up. So the problem was if your money was in the Wall Street or the stock market, you got rich, you got money. It was great. But before the 1920s, poor people, people with less money couldn't invest. They just didn't really have a way to get into the market because they didn't have any money. Now that's a problem for brokers. Why? Because they like when more people invest because they can charge them fees. That's how they make money. So the brokers want to get poor people involved, lower middle class. So changes were made or evolved to get the poor people involved. And what it's called is buying stock on margin. So let's say a stock costs $100. Now, a poor person might only have $20 to invest. So the stockbroker will give them a loan. And this is called buying stock on margin. They'll give them the extra $80. So stock on margin is a great idea because with only $20, somebody with less money can still buy a $100 stock. Now, guess what? That stock was going up in the 1920s, so they'll make a ton of money. They can take that extra ton of money and pay back their broker, and they still have money left over, which is awesome. So both made money, the broker and the person that had less money. Buying on margin is probably the greatest thing ever. But buying on margin is only great as long as the market goes up. If it crashes, you've been destroyed, financially speaking. So all of a sudden, the stock you bought went down and you lost your money. But guess what? You also took out a loan from your broker. Remember, you bought stock on margin. You got to pay the broker back. It's called a margin call. So now where are you going to get the money? If you had enough money to begin with, you wouldn't have had to buy on margin. So you immediately have to go for your life savings or sell your house, and that's going to be a problem. So lesson number 2, don't buy stock on margin. You want to diversify your savings, but if you're going to invest, don't buy stock on margin. There you go. You'll be fine now, hopefully. So why was there no spending? Well, the stock market crashed. People didn't diversify their investments. They were buying stock on margin. And reason 4, their savings accounts were lost. Now, the stock market crashed. Margin calls occur. People had to pay back their brokers. So what did people do? They ran to the banks to get their life savings. Not ideal, but they had to pay back the broker. Now, these were called bank runs. Now, the thing about it is banks take your money and then they loan it out. They give it out. So if everybody runs back to the bank at the exact same time, the bank is going to lose money. Now, if they lose money and don't have money, then they can't pay for electricity, they can't pay for their tellers, they can't pay for anything. So they go out of business just like a lemonade stand at the end of your street. Once banks go out of business because of a bank run like you're looking at, boom, there's nothing. You just lost your money. You could have put for 40 years straight all of your money in that bank. It's not coming back. And bank runs led to over 9,000 banks closing, all of their customers lose, or most of them losing their money. 50 years of savings, 60 years gone. Not even a note of apology. It's probably about the saddest thing I can think of. So that's going to lead to less spending. When 9,000 banks and most of their customers all lose their life savings, less spending, the economy is going to crash. Now, could this still happen today? Well, 4 years after this, kind of a hero is going to emerge. I call him President Roosevelt, and he's going to implement a thing called FDIC. And FDIC is basically insurance for banks. If they get robbed, if a nuclear bomb goes off, which happens so often, of course, or if a bank run occurs and they lose all of their money, their customers will still get paid back by the federal government under FDIC. So it's up to $250,000. So that's what the federal government has their back. If you walk into a bank and you don't see FDIC on a sign somewhere, go somewhere else, because if that bank fails, you lose everything. Now, the lesson here is that we need bank insurance for all of our banks. They're too high stakes of an industry to be left alone. So lesson number 3, bank insurance. Make sure your president does it. Hoover didn't do it. So why is there less spending? Well, banks were closed. They went out of business. There were margin calls that made the stock market crash even worse, and people didn't diversify their investments. So, the next reason, once banks closed, that was a problem for a different reason. Factories create jobs. I love businesses and factories. Now, they give paychecks to those people, and those people use those paychecks to spend money, which causes the economy to go up. However, starting businesses is super expensive, and you need at the beginning of that process to take out a loan from a bank, almost always. But in 1929, banks were going out of business, over 9,000 of them. So with less banks, now businesses weren't starting up. And if businesses weren't starting up, that means less spending, less jobs by the thousands, if not millions. So the lesson here is you need bank insurance to make sure that banks are around to provide loans to people to start businesses, because businesses are the backbone of this country. Maybe. So again, the lesson here is diversify your investments. Don't buy on margin. Have bank insurance if you're a country, for the purpose of providing loans, keeping banks alive to provide loans. Reason 6 why there was no more spending, and that would be people were hoarding money. Now, I wonder what hoarding was. I've seen a show about it. So there's two things you can do with your money. You can spend it, or you can save it. I feel like I've heard that before. Now, saving is bad for the economy, except even when you save your money, it still kind of gets spent, believe it or not. Savings can go to banks, and banks then, because you put your savings account in a bank, right? The bank then gives out in form of loans, and those loans are spent by people to start businesses or to build homes or buy anything. So in a way, your savings most of the time actually get spent anyway. That causes the economy to go up. Or another thing people do with their savings is they'll invest it in the stock market, which goes to corporations, which helps corporations get bigger. And then those corporations expand and create more jobs. And those people spend that money. And that's a great thing to help the economy. So savings can help the economy. But during the Great Depression, people didn't trust banks because they kept going out of business. I wouldn't either. And they don't trust the stock market because people lost billions of dollars there too. So what were people doing with their money? Same thing that I'm doing with it right now. They wouldn't put in the stock market or bank. Instead, they put it under their mattress. They hoarded it. Hoarding is keeping something to yourself, denying it to others. Now, if so much money was hidden, it couldn't help the economy, because the key to your money is your money has to circulate among the economy, has to go to businesses or people for them to keep spending it. This is a very complicated economic concept called the multiplier effect. Try to explain it. Let's say $100, a new $100 was found and it was given to you, and you spent it to buy a nice expensive piece of art worth $100. And then that artist that makes that art for you then buys an expensive new clock and pays that $100 to the clockmaker. Then the clockmaker takes that $100 and buys an expensive pair of Nike shoes. Now, here's the thing. That $100 has just made each of those three people $100 richer. One person has a $100 painting they didn't have before. One person has a $100 clock. One person has a $100 pair of shoes. And every time that $100 gets spent, people get $100 richer. They have more wealth. They have more stuff. By the end of the year, that $100 will actually increase the strength of the economy by millions of dollars if it keeps getting spent. That's the amazing thing. The wealth in society is not based off of paper currency. The wealth of a society gets bigger because of the multiplier effect. Now, if you're hoarding money, nobody gets to spend that money, and then the wealth does not get created and jobs are lost. And so hoarding leads to less spending, kills the multiplier effect. And the lesson there is we need bank insurance so that banks don't go out of business, so people don't get scared of banks and they don't hoard their money, because banks circulate money, your savings. So another lesson. Another reason why money wasn't being spent, which leads to the Great Depression, we got to a very low point, 25% unemployment rate. Now, the 25% unemployment rate, as you can see here, boom, we were all the way up here in the 20s, and not such a good thing. So that really went down. So the Great Depression was sad. So many people were out of work. 25%. For minorities, it was significantly higher. That was just an average. So why is that a problem? What's called the business cycle. Our economy goes up and down all the time anyway. So the Great Depression was really down, but there's lots of jobs when our economy is at the top. We call it prosperity. When it hits a recession, when it's going down, not so much jobs at the bottom. So the key here is to spend money. If you spend money, then it will go up. And that's the key. So 25% unemployment, there was just wasn't spending. Our economy wasn't bouncing back. We were stuck for like over 10 years. Now, somebody got a good idea to get people money so they could spend it, and that was unemployment insurance. This is basically a program that came out during the Great Depression that if you lost your job, you would still get money and so on. So during the 1920s, the economy goes up and then it starts going down. But the problem is, as it goes down, people lose jobs and they can't spend anymore. So if they can't spend, it just keeps going down. But unemployment insurance means even if you lose your job, you'll still get checks and money and you can still spend. And that's the key. This is the greatest program ever. When you have unemployment insurance, people get money to spend even when they don't have jobs. And that pulls you out of a recession or a Great Depression. So today we have unemployment compensation. It's a national program started with Social Security in 1935, but it didn't exist at the beginning of the Great Depression. And that's why things were so rough and why our economy took so long for us to get out of it. So the lesson there is support Social Security and unemployment compensation, and then you won't get into a depression. You'll still have tiny recessions, but it is what it is. Now, what's another reason we had no spending, which led to the Great Depression? This thing called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Now, there are tons of things sold in America, tons, but we can split them into two groups. Group number one, world goods, made by the world and sold to us, and domestic goods, things made by us, sold, you know it, to us. So for example, you could order a PS5 or an Xbox X Series. Now, one of them is made in America, that's the Xbox. So where are you sending your money? Now, Americans should spend it on the Xbox because Microsoft's an American company with American factories and American workers. You don't want our money sent overseas. Now, if you spend it on American companies, that protects American jobs. Now, if you read the following, during the Depression, the US was getting poor, so the US didn't want American money buying foreign goods. So President Hoover placed tariffs on foreign-made goods. So he did. He placed taxes on foreign-made goods called tariffs, making them more expensive so that Americans would say, you know what? I don't want to buy foreign goods. They're too expensive. I will buy American. In the short term, this helped US businesses. It was a great idea, except the world was like pretty pissed off. They're like, oh, you're making our goods more expensive? You're not buying our goods? Well, right back at you. And they put tariffs on all of our goods, so they didn't buy our stuff. Now, these tariffs that went in both directions meant minimal trade. Trade is a fancy word for saying spending. So we now were only buying from our people, which is our people is a lot less than the world. That's a lot less customers for every one of our businesses. And the whole world goes down into a depression, stops trading. Our economies just get terrible. This is probably the most egregious, terrible act that we did during this time, hurting everybody, the entire world. The US depression turned into a world depression because of this act. And I would make an argument that that world depression, those people are going to be experience such economic misery that they're going to elect and support people that wanted to better their countries by conquering because they couldn't do it because their economies were letting them down. So terrible economy led to misery, misery led to war. So bad act, don't do that. Reduce tariffs in times of economic crisis. Don't increase them. So why was there no spending? Well, taxes were too high. We were in the middle of a recession, soon to be a depression. Now, to help with the economy, the government should cut taxes. Why should they cut taxes? When you cut taxes, you give spending power to the people. You give them more money. They can spend that. When they spend it, it helps the economy. But now, 1929, taxes were not lowered, and that's Herbert Hoover's biggest mistake, maybe. Now, what he cared about was having a balanced budget. He knew the government he wanted to spend as much as he took in through taxes. And he didn't want to spend more than he took in through taxes. That would create debt, and it's irresponsible, at least the mentality at that time, to spend more money than you have and owe tons of money that you might not be able to pay back. So by him not being willing to basically lower taxes and go into debt, people are going to have to pay high taxes, and then that's less spending, less money they have. Now, to even add to it, while taxes in theory over the 1920s went down a little bit, local property taxes within each town went up. Public schools were taking off across the country, and public schools are funded by property taxes. So even though federal taxes went down a little bit, overall, people were paying a lot more taxes to fund a whole new public school system that blew up in the 1920s. And that's going to take money away from people. Again, money that they lost, they can't spend, and that hurts the economy a little bit. So, lesson, lower taxes during times of economic crisis. So, why was there less spending, which led to the Great Depression? There was no deficit spending done by Hoover. So the United States had a problem. We know about this. The American people weren't spending money. So we needed help quickly. So they called up the smartest person ever. And his name was John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes offered expert advice. He said, if people are not spending money in a society, somebody has to. So the government has to make up for the people. If the people are screwing up, government spend tons of money to make up for it, and that will get the economy going. Herbert Hoover was like, absolutely not. I'm not going into debt. No, without a doubt, the government doesn't have any money to spend. And Herbert Hoover was like, I only have this money, and you want me to spend all of this to make up for the people. Can't do it. So John Maynard Keynes says, no, Hoover, you need to borrow the money. It's called deficit spending. Run up a deficit, a debt. And, a deficit spending is when you spend more money than you take in, right? So Hoover's like, I won't do it. I won't go into debt. That's bad. So it's immoral. So John Maynard Keynes actually says it won't create a debt. Follow me. If the government spends tons of money, even money it doesn't have, it stimulates the economy. It creates jobs. Those people now have jobs. They're now going to pay taxes. The government will get that extra money and can pay down the debt. Everybody wins. You get a good economy and no debt. This is called fiscal policy. When the government messes with the tax system or their spending in order to stimulate the economy. So again, John Maynard Keynes told Hoover to do it, but he didn't do it. No deficit spending was really done under Hoover, minimal. So you could argue FDR did it later, and as you can see, the economy is going to bounce out because of the spending by the government. So, but huge debt, right? So what's another reason why there wasn't a lot of spending, which led to the Great Depression? It was because the money supply was lowered. Now we're getting into economics here. I know that's difficult. In 1913, a new group was formed. Now this is before the 1920s, right? Woodrow Wilson helped establish what was called the Federal Reserve. Now the Federal Reserve is an organization that works in Washington, D.C. Now their job is to regulate the economy. Now to increase spending, which is something the Federal Reserve wants to do, what they can do is they can add money into our country. Now, if you add money into our country, increase the money supply, with more money, people can spend it. And that stimulates the economy, right? More money. Now, how do they do that? Well, complicated. The government, basically, the Federal Reserve can buy back bonds. Now, you've heard of bonds, right? Basically, a bond is when you pay a bunch of cash to get a piece of paper, and then somebody will owe you money and pay you tons of interest, right? So what happens is people have a ton of cash and they have a ton of bonds. What the Federal Reserve can do is they can order you to give back the bonds. Now, when they do that, what happens is it gives you a ton of cash for that bond. So when the economy is looking bad, the Federal Reserve will buy back all these bonds from Americans by the millions, put in billions of dollars of cash. Now people can spend that money. They have increased the money supply, which leads to increase of spending, which stimulates the economy. But in 1929, the economy was going up. So this wasn't a problem. So the Federal Reserve did something not very smart. The Fed actually decreased the money supply. They took the amount of money in the economy and they actually lowered it. They did this how? Well, they did this by actually not buying bonds. They actually sold millions of bonds to take money from people. Tough, right? So anyway, during the Roaring, why do they do this? Because in the 1920s, it was the Roaring 20s. People were happy, spending tons of money. So the Federal Reserve wasn't worried about stimulating the economy and creating jobs and spending. They were actually worried about something totally different, which was inflation. Inflation is when the value of your money goes down or all prices go up, same thing. So basically what they did was they sold a ton of bonds and you got a bunch of bonds because it's a good investment, and now you had less cash to spend. They slowed down the economy. And when they slowed it down, bam, less spending because you had less cash, you had more bonds. Boom, the economy goes down. Less spending, less job creation. Welcome to the Great Depression. So good job, the Fed. So they should have increased the money supply at this time, but they decreased it. So what's another reason why people weren't spending money? Interest rates were raised. Oh, more economics, right? Well, in the 1920s, it was the Roaring 20s. It was a great time. The economy was going up. So the Federal Reserve said, Whoa, I'm not worried about a recession. I don't want to create jobs or spending. I'm worried about inflation. We talked about this, right? Inflation is when your money gets worth less so you can buy less goods. It's not a good thing. So basically, the Federal Reserve did something called monetary policy. What they did was they raised interest rates. The Federal Reserve is allowed indirectly to control the interest rates that banks charge when they give out loans. So when the Federal Reserve raised interest rates for all the banks, indirectly, of course, now all of a sudden, if you wanted to take out a loan from a bank, you had to pay a ton more interest. Loans were so expensive. So less people take out loans. And when less people take out loans, now they're not buying houses or cars or tons of fancy things. They're not going to spend that money, which was on purpose because the Federal Reserve wanted people to spend less money because when people spend a massive amount of money, prices go up, right? So it causes inflation when people spend tons of money. So this is the problem here is the Federal Reserve is going to raise interest rates. Less people are going to get loans, less people are going to spend money, and that's going to lead to a loss of jobs because remember, getting loans is how you start businesses and create jobs. So tough job, Federal Reserve in 1929. You screwed up. You screwed up by basically selling bonds and by raising interest rates, both of which stopped spending and hurt the economy. So why was there no more spending, which led to the Great Depression? We're almost done. Poor distribution of wealth across the United States. In 1929, we had a lot of wealth in the US, but the problem was that the wealth was not distributed well. It was inequitably distributed. There were too few rich people had too much money. So one of the reasons for this was during the 1920s and prior, unions were not recognized, and we know that unions fight to raise pay for the lower and middle classes. So slowly businesses are going to basically have lower salaries and accumulate more wealth. Also, deregulation. In the 1920s, we were very conservative, and basically, even prior to that, big businesses were allowed to gobble up all the small businesses, and monopolies were formed, and they weren't regulated strictly after the days of Taft and Roosevelt. And oligopolies are going to be formed. Those are basically like instead of one company like a monopoly dominating things, you have two, three, four. So now you have all these huge companies that have all this power over workers, over small businesses, and they are going to accumulate wealth. Now, why is this important that 0.1% of our country had 42% of its money? Well, that means the American people didn't have a lot of money because the rest of that money was with this rich group. So when the American people don't have a ton of money, they lose purchase power, buying power. That means that when it comes time for them to buy tons of stuff, they can't because they have less money. And when the people don't have a lot of money to spend because of inequity, they're not spending that money and the economy will crash. So we're at the end. So what caused the lack of spending that triggered the Great Depression? Man, we have a lot of answers. People did not diversify their investments. That's going to hurt them when the stock market crashes. They were buying on margin. Don't do that because when the market goes down, you get really hurt, and that leads to you running to banks. So what else led to not lack of spending money? We didn't have bank insurance, so savings accounts were destroyed by the thousands or millions. We didn't have bank insurance, so banks went out of business, and now there were no new loans for new businesses to be created. What's another example? We need bank insurance so people can put their money with confidence in banks. Otherwise, they hoard the money. And if people hoard the money, it's not circulating in the economy according to the multiplier effect and growing the economy. Also, we didn't have unemployment insurance. So when people lost money, they couldn't spend anything, and that brought the economy down. So unemployment insurance gives people money to spend, right? And so even if they lose their job, they can pull us out of a recession. Lower tariffs is what we need. Hoover raised tariffs, and then foreign countries weren't buying our stuff. We weren't buying theirs. Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was the worst thing on this list. We need to lower taxes, put money in people's pockets so they can spend during times of recession. We actually raise taxes in part because of the establishment of the public school system and Hoover's desire to have a balanced budget. John Maynard Keynes told us to use deficit spending. If people don't spend money, the government needs to spend that money. By spending more money than they take in through taxes, this creates debt, but then you'll be stimulating the economy. More people get jobs, they get paychecks, they'll pay more taxes. You can pay down that debt. It doesn't always happen that way, though. The Federal Reserve increased the money supply, or that's what they should have done, so that people had more money so they could spend it. They actually decreased the money supply in 1929 because they were worried about inflation. They did this by selling tons of bonds to people, taking people's cash away from them. Also, the Federal Reserve should lower interest rates during tough times, but instead they actually raised interest rates, the rates that banks have to charge to give out loans, because they were worried about inflation. So the Federal Reserve basically raised the cost of loans. People couldn't afford loans. If you can't get loans, you can't spend all that money. Our government should have regulated more and broken up monopolies and oligopolies, but they didn't, which allowed power and wealth to consolidate. And our government should have supported unions better in collective bargaining, because that would have led to a redistribution of wealth and wouldn't have let the super wealthy accumulate so much money, taking buying power away from the people. Because when the people don't have money, they can't spend. And if the people can't spend, you can't spend your way out of a depression. So tough times, absolutely. So I've given you plenty of reasons of the origins of the Great Depression, which are all about not spending money. So I gave you plenty of reasons why we weren't spending money, and that led to the Great Depression, our economy crashing. So look for your assignment on Google Classroom, and as always, work hard. I don't really have an ending statement. I'll try to work on that. Good luck, everyone.